Most Australians think that they need 10 properties to retire. Some even think they need 20. I've sat with clients who've spent a decade building a portfolio of 8+ properties, and they were further away from financial freedom than when they started because no one told them the truth. More properties is not the goal. The right properties is the goal. And those two strategies are not the same. Here's what I've seen work with hundreds of investors across the country. People who actually end up retiring early through property almost never have the biggest portfolios. They have the best structured ones. 5 properties built correctly with the right numbers behind them will outperform a dozen bought on emotion in the wrong markets with no exit plan. The problem is no one shows you what it actually looks like. They show you the outcome, the lifestyle, the freedom, the cars, but are never specific on the levers that got someone there. So that's what today's all about. I'm Corey Jones, and I've helped hundreds of everyday hardworking Aussies generate almost $100 million of equity in the last 6 years alone. Today I'm going to break down exactly how many properties you actually need to retire in Australia with a real portfolio, real structures, and 3 numbers that matter more than any other number in property. The truth is, the amount of property that you need will depend on your goals and the properties themselves, but more importantly, the strategy that you're implementing. Now let's take a normal house for example. The median house price today in Australia is sitting around $1 million. So let's say you go and put out some equity and use the equity as a deposit and cost to go and purchase that $1 million property. In most cases, you're going to need around $200,000 as a deposit and costs, which you would lend from one of your existing properties. Then we go to another bank with that deposit and we'd go and borrow the remaining $800,000. So what we've just done is we've borrowed $1 million, 200, then 800 to go and buy that $1 million asset. So that's what we call a 100% loan to value ratio split across 2 banks. Now, the median rent in Australia is about $750 a week. That would generate around $39,000 a year before costs. Now, when you generate the income, you've then got to pay the mortgage, the rates, the insurance, the maintenance, the management, and after claiming tax, while you still can, you're essentially paying around $20,000 in negative cash flow to own that property. So you then argue, well, why the hell would I buy a property? Well, the point is growth. You see, residential property in Australia is a growth asset, is not a cash flow asset, which means the money is not made from the rent. It's made from the buying it. Buying it today for $1 million and X amount of years, it's now worth $2 million, $3 million, so on and so forth. Now, all while covering that negative $20,000 a year expense. In other words, the only reason why you would even find this remotely feasible is that the property is growing at a faster rate than that negative $20,000 a year. In fact, the Australian national average median price grows around 7% a year on average. That's the historical average across long-term cycles in every major city in the country. So if we assume that that property is going to grow at a 7% rate, $1 million growing at 7%, that means it's growing at a rate of $70,000 per year, but still costing $20,000 to maintain. So you're still $50,000 a year wealthier than not. Now, the first way to think about this, if you own many properties that are all still negatively geared, so they're still costing you $20,000 a year, you are completely relying on the growth to retire, which is not going to allow you to stop working, by the way. Now, one would argue you could start selling off your properties one by one, spread them out over different financial tax years, and then by the time you sold them all, you've then spent all your money and you can essentially ride off into the sunset. The only problem with this is you need a lot more properties than the norm, and you need more than enough equity that's going to see you stop working today, basically, and see you all the way through until the day that you die. All right, so if we're talking a 40 or 50 year period, you will literally need dozens of properties. So let's take this even to a further extreme. Let's say you bought a house today for $1 million and you had 0 debt. So you've completely paid the debt off. Because you're still paying council rates, water rates, insurance, maintenance, and management forever, you can't escape those costs. That $1 million property would be paying you around $21,000 a year in full cash flow. That equals a 2.1% return. One way to think about it, as a professional investor, if I'm investing my money and getting a 2.1% return, I would be absolutely fuming. So in summary, option 1 here is to buy a lot of residential properties and then rely on them growing leaps and bounds faster than the cash flow, in the hope that one day, someday, you'll have enough equity, we can start selling them off one by one, paying your taxes, and you'll have enough time to liquidate them all, live off all the capital, and that would ride you off into the sunset. Option 2 would have you work your ass off, buy a house, pay it to zero, generate $21,000 a year per property, and you're going to need, obviously, probably 4 or 5 of those over a 10, 15, 20-year period. I'm going to be honest, guys. Neither of these strategies or scenarios are realistic for the average person. The average person accumulating 20 to 40 homes and then selling them one by one is going to be limited by bank servicing. In other words, the average person simply can't go and borrow that sort of money from the banks. The average person then accumulating, let's say, 5 properties, paying them all off to zero, would quite literally take over 100 years to do. I prefer to build a strategy that has my income replaced in 10 to 15 years rather than this taking more than 50. What I would recommend is build a strategy based on growth first and then reinvest that growth into cash flow assets later, That's where the money truly comes in. Now, when I say cash flow asset, think of things that don't grow really well but provide a lot of cash flow. So things like commercial property, short stay Airbnb, NDIS or SDA homes, co-living properties, overseas tourism-based property, businesses, high dividend paying stocks. So here's a real life example. House number 1, I bought in 2014 in Brisbane for $403,000. The bank valuation 5 years later in 2019 was $810,000. So I've basically doubled my money in 5 years. If I go and borrow $200,000 of that equity and then use that as a deposit and costs for a Bali villa, that Bali villa will generate me around $70,000 a year in positive cash flow. So to summarize that, I've now got 2 properties, one in Australia and one overseas. Combined, are growing at around $50,000 a year, plus generating me around $50,000 a year in positive cash flow. So if I do that 2 times over, then I would only need 2 assets in Australia. I've got 2 assets internationally. I'm bringing in growth of over $50,000 a year and positive cash flow of $100,000 a year. That would replace the median income. And that's quite literally with 4 assets. Or another scenario, house purchased in 2021 here in Perth for $378,000. The bank valuation 4 years later was $850,000. So I've more than doubled my money again. Now, if I go and borrow $200,000 of that equity and then use that as a deposit on an $850,000 commercial property, that commercial property has a tenancy of $77,000 a year, which is a 9% yield. Now, being commercial, that tenant also contributes for all the costs. So he pays for the council rates, the water rates, the insurance, the maintenance, the strata, the management, everything. I get clear 9%. Now, as that tenant continues to drive down my debt, by the time that I refinance that loan back to 30 years in 2035, so in 10 years' time, that property will be positively cash flowed by $40,000 a year. Now again, let's just assume that I do this model 3 times over. So that means I've got 3 residential buy and holds, and each one of those properties buys me its own commercial property with that deposit. That would mean I've got 3 residential properties that are generating over $120,000 a year within the space of 15 years. So as you can see, you don't need portfolios of 50 to 100 properties plus, which is what some guys talk about. Ultimately, there are 2 questions that I would pose. Firstly, what is your goal? And when I say what is your goal, what is your income goal? Do you want $100,000 a year, $200,000 a year? Because the goal fundamentally sets the goalposts. The goalposts dictates the distance. The second question I would have is how aggressively are you prepared to invest between now and then? For the most part, most people are accumulating properties like they're collecting cards. I find a better option is to understand what you're actually trying to achieve, being that growth or cash flow, and then accumulate properties in a well thought out strategy that actually gets you to the destination by the time that you want to get there. Now, if you guys do have properties that you feel like aren't generating the results you want, or you feel like you don't have a strategy, feel free to reach out to our team and we'd be more than happy to help.